there is one episode of the Andy Griffith Show that fans still argue about decades later. It brings Barney Fife home to Mayberry for what should be a joyful reunion, and it ends instead with heartbreak written all over Don Knotts' face. Some viewers call it the saddest half-hour the series ever produced. Rumors have swirled online for years claiming the episode was pulled from circulation or banned outright. Before we get into why that story took hold, and what actually happened when it aired, it helps to understand the man at the center of it all, because Andy Griffith's own life was full of the same kind of quiet heartbreak his most famous character rarely showed on screen. Long before he became one of television's most recognizable faces, Andy Griffith started out with very little. He was born in the middle of in Mount Airy, North Carolina, to a working-class family that struggled constantly to make ends meet. His parents were so strapped for money in his earliest years that they were forced to leave him in the care of relatives for a stretch of time before bringing him home. Even after his father eventually saved enough to buy a small house for the family, the place was nearly empty inside. There was so little furniture that Andy's first bed as an infant was reportedly a dresser drawer, padded and repurposed into a makeshift cradle because the family could not afford an actual crib. Andy grew up on what many in town considered the less desirable side of the tracks, and by most accounts he was a shy, quiet child who preferred to stay out of the spotlight rather than seek it out. Music became his refuge from a hardship around him, an outlet that let him escape, even briefly, from the day-to-day struggle of his family's finances. It was only when he discovered he could make his classmates laugh that something in him shifted. For the first time in his life, he wanted to be seen rather than overlooked, and that discovery quietly set the course for everything that followed. Throughout his teenage years, he threw himself into music and drama, sharpening skills that would eventually define his entire career. A local minister took an interest in him during this period, teaching him to play instruments, helping him develop his singing voice, and becoming something of a mentor figure. That relationship nearly sent Andy down an entirely different path in life. After finishing high school, he enrolled at the University of North Carolina with the intention of studying theology and becoming a minister himself, following in the footsteps of the man who had guided him. College changed his direction. Rather than the pulpit, the stage pulled him in, and he ultimately earned a degree in music. During his university years, he led the school's chapter of a respected national music fraternity and took starring roles in several classic stage productions. It became increasingly obvious to everyone around him, and eventually to Andy himself, that performing was where he was meant to be. Fame, however, did not arrive quickly. After graduating, Andy spent several years teaching music and drama at a high school in North Carolina, quietly shaping young minds rather than performing for large audiences. One of his students there would go on to become a well-known public radio broadcaster years later. For a while, it genuinely looked as though Andy might have set aside performing altogether in favor of a stable teaching career. During this period, he married his first wife, and the couple later adopted 2 children together. That marriage would eventually end in divorce after more than 2 decades, and years later the couple's son would tragically pass away following a long struggle with alcohol addiction. Through all of it, those who knew Andy said he never lost the warmth and easy humor that made him so likable. Ironically, the performance that first made Andy a household name was not on television or film at all. It was a comedy record. He recorded a monologue about a small-town preacher trying to make sense of a chaotic college football game for the very first time, and audiences across the country fell in love with its folksy, homespun humor. The recording climbed into the top 10 on the charts and introduced Andy Griffith's name to millions of listeners who had never heard of him before. That surprising success opened doors almost immediately, first into television and then onto Broadway. His true breakthrough came when he took the role of a cheerful, easygoing country boy struggling through military life in a stage production that eventually became a hit both on television and Broadway. Critics raved about his natural comic timing, and audiences were won over the moment he stepped onto the stage. One reviewer at the time joked that Andy barely needed to say a word to charm an entire theater. The role earned him a nomination for a major Broadway acting award, though the trophy ultimately went to another performer that year. It would not be the only time in his career that Andy came close to major recognition without quite landing it. He did, however, take home an award for Outstanding Broadway Debut that year, a clear sign that the industry saw real star potential in him. Not long after, a respected film director cast Andy in a very different kind of role, playing a manipulative and volatile media personality in a serious drama. It was one of the hardest performances of his career precisely because it required him to summon a darkness that felt completely foreign to his naturally warm and easygoing personality. The director later said that pulling out the character's harsher edges, especially during the film's emotional peak, took real effort from an actor who was fundamentally gentle by nature. Even so, Andy proved he had far more range than people expected. When his earlier military comedy role was adapted into a feature film, Andy reprised the same character for what was by then the third time across different formats, and the production introduced him to a young comic actor named Don Knotts. Their chemistry was immediate and would go on to become one of the great partnerships in television comedy history. Despite this growing success, Andy's path was not without setbacks. He returned to Broadway again a couple of years later for a musical western opposite another well-known actress, and once again critics loved him while awards voters looked elsewhere. Then came a genuine low point. A film he starred in around this time turned out to be a critical and commercial disappointment, and the experience left him seriously questioning whether Hollywood was the right place for him at all. Rather than keep chasing movie roles, he made the bold decision to step away from film entirely and refocus on television. That choice would end up defining the rest of his career. Andy's return to television came through a guest appearance on an established sitcom, where he played a small-town sheriff. That episode functioned as a backdoor pilot for what would soon become his own show. Interestingly, the very first version of that sheriff character was much sharper-edged and more self-serving than the warm, wise figure audiences would later fall in love with, using his overlapping small-town positions of authority to bend situations in his own favor before eventually softening into someone far more likable by the time the series proper began. Behind the scenes of the show that followed, life was not always as peaceful as it looked on screen. Andy enjoyed keeping the set relaxed, often singing, joking, and playing light-hearted pranks with the cast between takes. Not everyone appreciated that atmosphere. Frances Bavier, who played Aunt Bee, preferred a strictly professional environment and rarely joined in on the informal fun, which created ongoing friction between her and several castmates, Andy included. Years after the show ended, when Andy and his former co-star Ron Howard tried to visit her at her North Carolina home, she reportedly turned them away at the door. It was not until she became seriously ill much later that she reached out to make amends for the distance she had kept. One relationship on set, however, remained rock solid throughout. When the series began, Andy assumed he would naturally be its primary comedic engine. It did not take him long to realize that his co-star possessed an extraordinary gift for physical comedy and timing that outshone anything he could do in that department. Rather than compete for laughs, Andy made the generous choice to play the straight man, stepping back so his friend's nervous, excitable deputy character could shine. He later described those early seasons together as among the happiest years of his entire career. That partnership almost ended earlier than fans realize. Andy had originally believed the show would only run for about 5 seasons and encouraged his co-star to plan his career accordingly. Trusting that advice, the actor signed on to a movie contract elsewhere. When the network decided to keep the series going well past its 5th season, there was little anyone could do to undo that decision, and the beloved deputy character became only an occasional guest star rather than a permanent cast member from that point forward. Despite carrying the show for 8 seasons as its title character, one accolade consistently eluded Andy. His co-stars won multiple acting awards for their performances on the series over the years. Andy himself never received a single major nomination for playing the sheriff whose name was literally in the show's title, an odd footnote in an otherwise enormously successful run. By the late after years as the heart of the show, Andy decided it was time to move on to new opportunities, even though the network wanted to keep the series going. He did not walk away entirely. He stayed on as an executive producer helping shape the direction of a spin-off series and even returned periodically for guest appearances, including the episode where his character finally married his longtime love interest. The original series ended its run while still the #1 program in the country, a genuinely rare accomplishment, having never once fallen out of the top 7 shows during its entire time on air. The years that followed were surprisingly difficult for Andy professionally. He started his own production company and starred in a string of new television projects, none of which managed to recapture the magic of his earlier success. A major multi-picture film deal with a large studio also fell apart after the first movie turned out poorly, souring the relationship enough that Andy refused to fulfill the rest of his contract. Around the same time, he clashed with network executives on another new series, disagreeing sharply over creative direction, and ultimately walked away from that project after filming only a couple of episodes, even though both had actually performed well in ratings. A turning point came when Andy took on a dramatic role playing a grieving father in a television movie about a real crime, a significant departure from the gentle characters audiences associated with him. The performance earned him his only major prime-time acting nomination. Though he did not win, the role opened an important door, leading to another dramatic part as a defense attorney in a television miniseries. That performance caught the attention of a network executive who immediately saw potential for an entire series built around Andy as a courtroom lawyer. Before that new opportunity could become reality, Andy faced the most serious health scare of his life. In the early, he was diagnosed with Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare neurological disorder that left him unable to walk for several months, temporarily paralyzed from the knees down. The recovery process was slow and uncertain, and for a time it was unclear whether he would ever return to performing at all. He pushed through it. After months of rehabilitation, Andy came back stronger and stepped into the role that would define the second great chapter of his career, playing a sharp, unassuming Southern defense attorney on a new legal drama series. The show ran for nearly a decade and once again made Andy the lead of one of television's most watched programs, an extraordinary second act nearly 2 decades after his first series had ended. What audiences rarely realized was just how physically demanding that role remained for him, even years after his illness. Lingering weakness in his legs meant he often had to wear knee braces underneath his wardrobe just to stand through long courtroom scenes. Those seemingly effortless courtroom monologues that looked so smooth on screen actually required real physical endurance behind the camera. His preparation process was equally rigorous. He would memorize lengthy courtroom speeches over the course of a week, often reciting entire monologues flawlessly in a single take, occasionally earning spontaneous applause from the crew on set. Interestingly, Andy did not immediately warm to the character himself, initially finding the lawyer's vanity and frugal personality somewhat off-putting. Over time, working closely with the show's producer, he grew to appreciate the role's quirks, and the two men found a creative balance between grounded, emotionally serious storytelling and a more approachable, likable tone that ultimately defined the series. Even during the height of that show's success, Andy made real personal sacrifices to stay close to home. For roughly 6 years, he commuted almost weekly between the West Coast, where the show filmed, and his home on the North Carolina coast, where he lived with his third wife. He would finish filming on a Friday, fly home for the weekend, and return to set by Monday morning, an exhausting routine he kept up for years rather than uproot his family. When the series eventually experienced a ratings dip and the original network began shifting away from programming aimed at older audiences, it was canceled. Andy was not ready to let it go. He helped negotiate a move to a different network and proposed relocating production to North Carolina, a decision that both cut costs and let him stay closer to home. The strategy worked, extending the show for several more seasons and giving it a proper conclusion rather than an abrupt cancellation. Andy found lasting personal happiness during this period as well, marrying an actress he had met years earlier through an outdoor historical drama in which he had once performed. Unlike his 2 previous marriages, this one lasted for the rest of his life. Despite becoming famous first as a beloved sheriff and later as a shrewd attorney, Andy never abandoned the musical passion that had shaped his earliest years. He recorded several gospel and country albums throughout his career, and one collection of hymns released later in his life became a platinum-selling success and earned him a Grammy Award, giving him a form of recognition in music that had somewhat eluded him as an actor for decades. Even late in life, his name still carried unusual weight. In the mid, a man in Wisconsin legally changed his own name to closely resemble Andy's before running for local sheriff, a move Andy believed was a deliberate attempt to capitalize on his fame. He filed a lawsuit over it, though a judge ultimately ruled against him, finding the man's actions protected under free speech principles, an unusual footnote to an otherwise remarkable career. Andy continued facing health challenges with the same quiet resilience that had always defined him. He underwent major heart bypass surgery in his later years and recovered successfully, and he later fractured his hip in a fall but fought his way back from that as well. Eventually, after suffering a heart attack at his coastal North Carolina home, Andy passed away, having lived a long and remarkably full life defined by more comebacks than most performers ever get. Now, back to that episode. Few installments of the Andy Griffith Show have divided fans quite like the one that brought Barney back to Mayberry for a high school reunion. For many longtime viewers, it stands as the single saddest episode the series ever made. Some have criticized it as needlessly painful, questioning why the writers chose to put such a beloved character through so much heartbreak. Others consider it one of the show's most honest and memorable hours precisely because of that emotional weight. The episode centers on a 20th anniversary reunion for Mayberry's high school class, a class that includes Andy, Barney, and Barney's longtime on-again off-again sweetheart. Barney travels back from his new job in a bigger city, and at first everything feels comfortably familiar, as though no time has passed at all. Then he learns that his former girlfriend will also be attending. Andy, and the audience along with him, cannot help but wonder whether fate is offering Barney one last chance to finally settle down with a woman who waited through years of his indecision. Barney certainly seems to believe it might be. To him, the reunion feels like more than a chance to catch up with old classmates. It feels like an opportunity to finally claim a future he had never taken seriously enough to pursue. Then reality lands hard. When his former sweetheart finally arrives, Barney discovers she grew tired of waiting for him, moved on with her life, and married someone else entirely. The disappointment on his face in that moment needs almost no dialogue at all to communicate. It remains one of the most quietly devastating scenes in the entire series, largely because so little is actually said. The episode clearly wants viewers to feel for Barney, but it also gently reminds them of the road that led him there. As endearing and funny as Barney had always been, he rarely treated that relationship with the seriousness it deserved across the years, repeatedly getting distracted, dragging his feet, and prioritizing his own ego over building an actual future with her. Even when he took the new job that pulled him away from Mayberry, she never seemed to factor meaningfully into his plans. Because of that history, the episode lands as bittersweet rather than simply cruel. Barney faces a painful reality check, but his former sweetheart finally gets the happiness and commitment she had waited years for. In its own way, her ending feels just as satisfying as his is heartbreaking. Longtime fans know the story does not end there permanently. In a reunion television movie made 2 decades later, Barney and his former sweetheart do eventually marry after all, giving audiences the resolution many had hoped for, even if it took far longer than anyone expected. Here is the part worth clearing up directly. Despite the persistent rumor that circulates online, this episode was never actually banned, pulled from syndication, or suppressed by any network.